Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Essence Podcast Into the Woods, where I go into the woods to meet with folkloric and traditional practitioners and other spiritual folk from all over the place. And today we're going down under again, and we're going into a woods that I have not gone into to meet Dorian Manticore. Hello, Dorian.
Hello.
Hello, welcome. I was able
Thank
to
you.
coax you out with breadcrumbs.
Yes. I know I can be a bit hard to get a hold of.
Okay, we'll get you organized. We'll get you organized. So, for those people who don't know Dorian, many of you may know Dorian from online. Many of you may have, especially the gay male pagan community. But for those who are listening who don't know who Dorian is, Dorian Manticore is a creative hailing from Narrm, Kulin Nation lands in so-called Melbourne, Australia. We're an author, poet, LARP, creator, artist, disability and trans rights activist, and a crafter and maker, and really a wonderful crafter. I've seen loads of pictures of your stuff, and it's absolutely gorgeous. Dorian has been a practicing pagan witch for roughly the past 23 years, firstly by solitary practice, then joining the reclaiming community, becoming involved in numerous events such as the Australian Wiccan Conference, and serving as a committee member of the Pagan Collective of Victoria, a local community not-for-profit organization. They've hosted numerous workshops, talks, and public rituals. They are the founder of Sovereigns of the Golden Path, affectionately known as the Sun Cult, a queer-centering emerging magical tradition with roots in animism, ecstatic witchcraft, reclaiming, chaos magic, and leftist politics. They are a queer, trans, neurospicy nerd, disabled, elder, millennial, tragic, and cat dad. And I feel really connected to that elder, millennial, tragic, and one of those myself. In his spare time, he enjoys dressing like an extra from a post-apocalyptic film, playing video games, and bobbing around in the sea like a cork. Well, I'm glad that you were able to come out to the sea and join us today, Dorian.
Yes, I get in the sea as an insult is one of those things that I started saying ironically and then just it worked its way into my vocabulary.
That seems like it strikes me as like a common denominator in a lot of your activities. It's just started as a joke and then became a big thing for you, right?
Very much so, yes.
Love it. I love it. Well, we're going to get to the sun cult for you. It started as a joke and then it developed into something bigger. But first, I think let's really branch off. 23 years. What
Yes.
got you started? I mean, reclaiming makes total sense considering some of the people I know you run with, but what got you started? What made you interested? Where did you come from?
So I was raised in a relatively non-religious environment. My parents were like kind of Presbyterian Protestant side of things, but weren't really involved in any local religious communities. And I struggled a lot with my various identities growing up. It was the 90s. There wasn't really any queer representation. I didn't have any peers or elders to look up to. Unfortunately, that's something I've explored a bit in my writing is that when I was kind of coming of age, the AIDS crisis had basically obliterated any community that I might have otherwise come into when I became a teenager, and so I was kind of like had a bit of a cargo cult situation, trying to piece together my identity and things like that from little scraps and odds and ends that I could find, and I have this really distinct memory of being quite young. I was still essentially a child. I think I was about 12, of like having this cultural context of like heaven and hell. And I didn't really understand what I was, but I felt like what I was wrong and incorrect, and I was going to hell. And I kind of just went, no, I don't want this, and like rage quit that entire, like, no, like I refuse. And I felt very incredibly vehemently about this. And that is when I had my kind of spiritual awakening almost. I built a relationship with Lilith, and she was the first one that I ever had any kind of contact with and heavy relationship with. And that was kind of very inspired by my rejection of everything that I felt was a cultural context telling me that I was, an abomination and a wrong and incorrect. And So I had all these very intense feelings about, like, I didn't really know what I was, but I knew I didn't fit in. And I knew it wasn't my fault, and I had this incredible sense of injustice that it wasn't my fault. And I also was, because of that history, like ragingly misanthropic as a child. So I got along much better with non-human animals and plants and family pets and things like that, and kind of eschewed the company of my fellow humans. And so yeah, I began developing relationships with the plants and the insects in the garden. I'd spend hours in the back of the garden, talking to the bugs and things, and the praying mantises and the birds. And one of the first books I ever got my hands on was Ted Andrews' Animal Speak.
Oh.
Looking back on it, it's pretty cringy. But yeah, I didn't really have a lot of resources apart from this very new age crystal shop that was kind of local to me. So yeah, that was something that was my introduction to the concept of animism, and it kind of like it felt very natural to me because it felt like something I had already been doing all of my life, is getting like just like talking to places and trees and trying to like actually like having built relationships with things that uh all of these kind of messy human stuff didn't matter to. Like I could go for walks in nature, and it was where I really felt at peace and at home, was like going for walks in the wilderness, and all of those kind of troubles could kind of melt away from me, and I felt very at home, and kind of that phrase that I hear pagans use quite a lot, the soft, warm animal of your body. Like I felt like an animal in these spaces, and that was very healing to me. And yeah, so I kind of practiced that kind of animistic, very animalistic magic for a very long time. I had a couple of peers that were a big influence on me, like Lupa Greenwolf, I think, is one of my biggest peers. And I used to collect animal bones, and I would like ask them for permission on whether or not I would be able to keep them. And I had this very kind of open-handed relationship with the things that I worked with. So like it wasn't very I always tried to be very humble, and it was never a particularly transactional relationship. It was, like, would you like to do this? Or like, would you like, is there anything you want to talk to me about? Or like, so it's very conversational a lot of the time, and that still carries through to my current practice. I've had some really interesting experiences with beings in which we just kind of like, had a chat. And that was yeah, quite interesting. But yes, as I grew
Yeah.
older, I began to have access to the internet, and I began to read more widely, and I found that there was just so much information out there. Especially, I became more exposed to Wicca, about people talking about covens so much, and I felt kind of sad about it because I was solitary for like a good solid 10 years at least, probably more, before I even met another pagan. Yeah, like I was, yeah, raised by wolves. Yeah, and
Mm,
I over time started to slowly crave connection and community, and there were things that I could read about in books, but
mm,
like at the time, the books that I had access to, a lot of it was couched in language that was kind of obfuscated, or it wasn't very clear, or it wasn't very or it was either overly simplistic, or it was kind of like probably too advanced for my level, or my level of understanding. And so there was like significant gaps in my knowledge, and I had this real craving for both community and also to actually build a more solid foundation in my practice, because I did a lot of ecstatic trance work in my personal practice, but I
mm.
didn't really know how to do much else other than that. I did a
Nice,
little bit of
nice.
divination, and yeah, that was about it. I didn't feel like I had a strong grounding. And then I found out about Reclaiming Witch Camps and the Australian Wiccan Conference. And I chose the first event I ever went to. I went to the Australian Wiccan Conference because it was shorter, because I was kind of scared of going on a week-long camp with a bunch of strangers. And yeah, so I went on to a 3-day Wiccan conference and met a whole bunch of people, and ended up having a lovely time. And then the
Mm.
following year, I threw myself into a reclaiming witch camp, which was a
You
five
built
day
up
long.
to it.
Yes. And that was an incredible introduction to the community. The people
Yeah.
there were so welcoming and so incredible, and I felt so loved and like I had come home, essentially.
Mm.
And yeah, it was a wonderful experience. And I did a reclaiming teaching like course, basically, where
Mhm.
they call it elements of magic, and it's kind of like reclaiming 101. And they go over circle casting as well as like reclaiming culture. And it was like a really fantastic experience for me, because it actually gave me like filled in a lot of those gaps in my knowledge that
Right.
I had missing from being entirely self-taught. And yeah, once I found that I really adored these people, I kind of yeah, didn't look back, and I've really thrown myself into community building and being a member of my local community as much as possible.
Love it. I love it. I don't think people in North America or Europe necessarily really understand how impactful reclaiming is on the Australian community. It seems like every single person I speak to from down there, even New Zealand too, is reclaiming, reclaiming, reclaiming. How does, maybe I'll get your opinion on this. How do you think that particular important tradition has impacted kind of how the community down there operates versus say North America? What have you noticed?
Um, we have a very strong community here in Victoria, as well as in Brisbane, because we run 2 witch camps. And I've been to quite a few now. I couldn't tell you what year my first one was, because I count them in my head by what the theme was rather than the
Uh,
year. But yeah, it's Reclaiming Victoria has a pretty it has a very strong North American influence, because a lot of the teachers from North America would fly down here to teach here. And yeah, we are like over time kind of developing our own unique flavor of reclaiming our own unique
mm,
cultural quirks and whatnot. But yeah, it definitely has had a huge impact, because it's been such a community that's really passionate and really welcoming, and runs very frequent events, which I think is
yes.
really important. And having people that kind of have that level of consistency, I think, is really
Mm,
important to show that this is going to continue operating. Because we've had like reclaiming, I think part of why it's been so impactful on the culture here is
mm,
we do have a few meets, a few groups that do publicly open social gatherings. But reclaiming is really probably the strongest, most visible force in terms of welcoming people from like outside of the community to do magic. Like I stumbled across them because I went looking for people who were doing magic who would accept someone who they didn't know. And because I didn't have an in into that community. So I
mm.
think that's a big reason why it's been so impactful, is because yeah, anyone can turn up and be like, I'm interested. What do you do?
Right.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. That makes a lot of sense. So many of the groups up here, you stumble upon them like the festivals, you stumble upon them, and then you either are an insider or an outsider, right? Depending on how you relate to the people who are on the inside, all with the covenant structure being invited in. And I know that that also happens down there. It's quite a vast number of traditions that are down south there, but it's an interesting thing. I have to ask, because I know it's become such a big part of your practice now, kind of dialing back a little bit, going back to the 90s, what were some of the pop cultural influences on you? Because I know like the Australian kid shows and how they impacted me in reruns up here. So I'm curious for you, what were some of the impacts there that impacted you?
Um, I think some of I loved. a lot of pop culture stuff growing up that wasn't human centric. So
Yeah.
like a core cultural trauma for a lot of people my age is both the animals of Farthing Wood and
Mm-hmm.
Watership Down, because they
Yeah.
were screened on public free-to-air television here.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And yeah, like Watership Down and as one of those films that kind of I think scarred most Australian children a little bit. um, yeah, actually, that's a really interesting question because I haven't watched it in years. But when I think about that, one of the things that pops into my mind is an iconic Australian television series called Round the Twist.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I was just thinking about. Let me guess. Let
Yes,
me guess. The Fox episodes, right?
yes, I was thinking of that one. It was, yeah, like looking back on it, it's like, oh, that is so witchy.
Right. Yeah, and I know. I remember we actually spoke about that on your wall at some point, or in private at some point, like years ago. That was a really impactful one for me too. Like I'm not. I don't actually think it ever showed in North America. I know that things like Ocean Girl, The Tribe, and a couple of those types of shows, but I don't think Around the Twist ever came in. Can you give us a synopsis of that episode?
Round the Twist is a kind of magical realism children's television series about a family that are caretakers of a lighthouse. And there was one particular incredibly iconic episode, and I'm really struggling to remember the details, but I remember it involved a like a fox skin and somebody having a relationship with this fox skin, and they ended up, I believe they ended up burying it under a lemon tree, like at the
Yeah,
fox's request. And yeah, it was this really like incredibly intensely animist storyline. Like it had it was a very wild show. A lot of shenanigans happened, but yeah, that was a very deeply animist episode.
that's right. And if memory serves, the fox is reincarnated at the end and goes and trots off into the woods. That's right. Yeah, that's right. It strikes me again, thinking about some of those other TV shows, like there's so many like animist elements, like Ocean Girl, for example, right? Alien has a whale as a best friend. They save the world, right? You know, even things like the girl from tomorrow, right? You know, the whole in between getting through post-apocalyptic nightmare, right? Mm. Do you find that when you're, especially in the LARPing community, and we'll come to LARPing in a moment, do you find that those elements, there are certain themes of what people were watching when they were younger that brought them to magic and LARPing and things like that?
Yeah, I find that a lot of these kind of themes are very deeply steeped in kind of an Australian Gothic kind of mentality of there's a lot of a very we have an interesting culture here because there was a lot of things that are very close under the surface that people kind of don't really like to examine because they can be very thorny issues, but they do tend to kind of bubble up out of our pop culture quite frequently. So there's like things that are like really interesting parts of Australian culture, like there is a whaling community called Eden up the coast, and the local whalers had a mutualistic relationship with a pod of killer whales that would actually assist
Mm.
them in fishing. And so so we've got this really interesting kind of culture of like on the one hand being a British colonial project, and this kind of like adversarial relationship with the land, and at times also it can be very mutualistic, and people find themselves like importing traditions like here in Australia when building a new building, the old British Isles tradition of burying like a cat under the floorboards. People would bury possums instead because they were like the closest
Mm.
analog. So
Right.
we have this really interesting kind of hybridization as well of culture, as well as this kind of uneasiness of the horrors of colonization. And I think that really does brew through in a lot of our like culture, LARPing culture, because at least several of the LARPs that I've personally attended and know of are like many of them actually do deal with like politics of like colonization as a heavy theme, or alternatively just like resource scarcity as a very strong theme, especially in some of the post-apocalyptic media. Because just as an example, in Tasmania, there was a massive prison there, and it's in a land that is very lacking in fresh water. So there's this real sense of like of the island itself having that kind of adversarial relationship. Is if there were many cases that people escaped from the prison there, but they couldn't survive because there wasn't any water for them available that they knew about.
Mm.
And of course, the indigenous people knew how to survive in the area, but the colonists didn't. And so there's this kind of uneasy relationship with land. On the one hand, it's provide so much bounty. On the other hand, it's like yeah, it can be very dangerous, especially since we do have a lot of the cliches are all true. We have a ridiculous amount of spiders and snakes and crocodiles and things like that. It's very dangerous. Like I had a friend visit from New Zealand, and I was telling my friend like, like there's like the trees are like full of venomous spiders and snakes, and they were like, oh, I'll just go down into the water then. And I was telling them about like sea fleas and like ticks and things like that can attack you in the water, and I'm like, you're not safe anyway.
I love that. I love that so much. I love that. Not, well, I don't. I'm not saying I love the land is attacking you, but that piece around the building relationship while there's that adversarial quality there. I'm curious with the LARPs down there. Are they mostly Nordic style, are they North American style, or kind of both? Where do they fit in?
We have essentially kind of three camps roughly. We've got a battle game which people use. It's like the equivalent of a buffer LARP, but we use like pretty realistic latex weapons.
Mm.
And that's I personally would consider that more of a sport. There is like a storyline aspect to it, and people get very invested in their costuming, and they meet weekly and occasionally have longer events. But I'd say that the story is kind of secondary to the hitting each other with foam sticks.
Fair.
Yeah,
That makes
then
sense.
we also have some groups that focus primarily on storyline and on ongoing storylines, and then we've also got some groups that do like smaller games, like parlor LARPs essentially. So yeah, very very Nordic focused, those ones.
Mm. That makes sense. That makes sense. Okay. Kind of spiraling back then to that adversarial quality. I'm very curious then for you. I love what you said about how reclaiming is taking on an Australian aspect, like it's forming down there into something different. I'm curious then, how does that adversarial kind of aspect of a land impact your personal relationships and your magic then? I know you've developed these relationships since you were really young, but does it still pop up, and how do you deal with that? How do you navigate that for yourself?
Oh, it is a work that cannot be completed within my lifetime. It is yeah, something that I am always very conscious of, and it colors how I see the world and how I move through the land. I recently completed a decolonization workshop from an indigenous friend of mine that was very eye-opening and enlightening, and kind of reframed things that I'd been struggling with a bit about I am renting currently, and we are in the midst of a absolutely stupendous housing crisis at the moment. There is like huge housing uncertainty, and that really colors my perception of. I kind of identify as a feral animal. I I have kind of a strong relationship with foxes and fox spirits, because I feel like I I can't go back to Scotland, but I don't really belong here. And I feel like the
Oh.
fact that I don't own land is also very colored by that. If I like, owned a station property or something like a cattle ranch, I would probably end up feeling quite different about it. But because I don't, because I'm only renting, it has that temporary kind of ill-fitting, don't really fit here, don't really belong here sense of discomfort. And
Mm.
so yeah, the way that I move through the land is very, very influenced by that. Just like a small little personal anecdote is I as I mentioned before, like having conversations with trees and things like that, and sometimes they talk back without trying to sound too unhinged. So where
The
I'm
people who are
currently
listening to this are all unhinged, too, myself included. It's all good.
excellent. Where I'm currently living, up until relatively recently, was farmland, and I went for a walk just trying to get to know the area when I first moved here, and I found this beautiful pine tree that had been planted as a windbreak. They're lining a road now, but they were originally planted as a windbreak between cattle grazing fields. And as I was walking around, I noticed this beautiful tree, and I kind of sat down to kind of have a conversation with this tree. And I noticed that very deeply embedded into it was a strand of barbed wire from where that
Mm.
had been, that fencing running through it. And this is a beautiful, stunning tree, but also completely not native. And I kind of gave the barbed wire a little tug, and I noticed like really, really deeply wedged in there, like that this tree must be probably at least 100 years old. And the tree kind of quietly said to me, like don't do that, don't pull on it. And it was like, and I was looking at it thinking, like, man, that would be really hard to get out. And the tree was like, no, no, I don't want you to try to pull this barbed wire out. And I said to it, but doesn't it hurt? And the tree said, yes, it does. And but it is what it is. Sometimes our scars become a part of us. And that was just an incredibly
Ooh.
moving moment to me that really affected how I think about my relationship with the land. And yeah, so it's like I think of myself as coming from Wurundjeri country because that is where I was born and it is where I spent most of my life. Uh, Even though I'm not like indigenous myself, I feel this really strong connection to this area, and the idea of having to live anywhere else quite deeply upsets me because it's
Yes.
like this is the land that I have spent most of my life breathing on and sleeping on, and trees absorb most of their mass out of the air. So it's like the breath that came from my breath is where the trees gained their carbon from. And so it's like this is like my home. And yeah, so and I found myself really appreciating more and more when I would travel throughout Victoria, oftentimes for gatherings, people do either welcome to country by an Indigenous person or an acknowledgement of country if an Indigenous person isn't present to do that, and where you talk about the traditional custodians of that land. And I think some people started to kind of feel it as like a bit of a formality, but as I
Mm.
began to become more conscious of this, I begin to really appreciate that if I travel to the other side of the bay where I live, that's a different country. It's like me going from like Italy to Germany. It is not the
Yeah,
same place.
it's not the
And
same
like
place.
yeah, and like the fungal networks, the mycelium networks there are different. The trees are different. The microclimates are different. The animals
Yeah.
are different, and it's like everything about this land. It's not just like a surface level thing. Like this is, it's given me a really greater appreciation of like when I'm moving about, like where am I? Whose country is this? How can I walk softly on this land? And yeah, it's changed so much and it will never be able to go back to the way that it was before, and I can't leave. And so it's like this very uncomfortable relationship, and I am growing more accepting of sitting within that discomfort because there aren't any easy answers to that, and there's so much to unpack there, and I can just do as much as I can to heal what I can while I can.
I love that's the point of it, isn't it? That responsibility piece. I feel like a lot of people. You mentioned the feeling like land acknowledgement became or becomes a formality, and the same thing happens up here. Um, a lot of times it's like we're opening a letter, let's do a land acknowledgement. It's stupid stuff like that, right? But when you actually get down to it, it's that something I was taught by Dr. Robin Wall Kimmerer, who came out with Radiant Sweetgrass, absolutely fabulous book. She talks about how non-Indigenous people can never be Indigenous, but they can become Indigenized. And it's that stepping into that responsibility. You can have a different relationship with the landscape, but you can have the same responsibility as Indigenous people to that landscape. That's a really important factor there. Absolutely. Yeah. So for you then, when you enter into different lands, I mean, people, I think people in North America and people in Britain certainly don't realize how massive Australia is. I mean, it's pretty much the same size as Canada when you really look at it. When you enter into other lands down there, what's the visceral feeling like? Is it a visceral feeling? Is it a knowing? Like, help my listeners to understand your process or what your experience.
I think honestly, a uh as a non-Indigenous person, when traveling between lands, I do have times where I'm may not really notice because I'm just not that keyed into it, because I'm thinking about what I'm going to cook for dinner, or I'm late for an appointment, or things like that. And I have that kind of cultural blinkers that if I am going to drop into that space, it still does need to be a conscious act for me. I need to like actually focus and feel it. And like if I'm staying somewhere overnight, I usually just try to just take a few minutes to just like walk outside and just kind of deep listening. I've heard some people described it as just kind of drop in and be just like, hi, I'm staying here, these are my intentions, this is why I'm here, I'll be leaving soon, I don't have any ill will, just kind of announcing myself. Although sometimes I have had occasions where I have been like traveling by car somewhere, and I've just had this really intense feeling of crossing a threshold. Sometimes there's no markers, but just like you just pass by and just think like, oh, I'm not in the same place anymore.
Yeah.
It's like an invisible doorway that you just passed through, and you're like, oh, that's I felt that. Yeah, so it's yeah, it can vary quite a bit. And when I personally have gatherings and like public rituals and things like that, I like to go around the circle and ask everybody, where did you travel from today to come
Mm.
here? And like what the like I love hearing like, what rivers did you cross to get here? Because
Yeah.
yeah, I live along the coast. There's a great many rivers that feed down into the bay here. And so yeah, it is something that I yeah have to be conscious of. But it's kind of, yeah, it's just quietening your mind and just kind of opening your heart really to like what the energy of your surrounds are. Like I do this relatively frequently with a sort of egregore, I suppose you could call it, of the city of Melbourne itself. I consider the city to be one of my deities. And so oftentimes when I travel to the city, I'll have conversations with it, or I'll try to drop into its energy. And sometimes I find it can be very aggressive, or it's very cheerful, or it's fearful. It has very strong emotions that seem to course through the people. And it's almost like the people are like its blood cells moving through it.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I've had occasions where I thought like, oh, I think it's feeling a little bit feisty tonight, and I've been like sitting in a cafe, and they're like, oh, it's like feeling a bit agitated, and then like a fist fight will break out in front of me or something, like it's yeah, it's really fascinating seeing how that kind of manifests in my surroundings, and just trying to be observant of that of the vibes essentially.
You're gonna hate me. I remember you said that you end up meeting a lot of spirits in dreams, and that you often think that maybe you're just like this little cute little Labrador that just kind of wanders up and starts talking and then wanders away.
Yes.
That's the feeling of when you're just sitting in a cafe and a fist fight starts in front of you. It's like, oh, city of Melbourne. Oh,
Right. Yes. I I started keeping a little a Twitter account of every time I had conversations with the city, because it felt like it kind of a fitting level of immediacy of just like, when I get these little snatches, I would write them down. And one of the most recent ones that I posted was that there was a building that I used to be very fond of. It had an esoteric bookstore there that I used to visit quite a lot when I was a teenager. And it got torn down, and I was very sad about it. And I like tried to kind of drop into that space, and I like asked the city, like, does it hurt when these buildings get torn down? It's like 100-year-old ancient brick building. And it replied back saying, does it hurt when one of your individual cells die? I was
oh,
really taken aback by that, because I found that
mm.
very big things tend to be very unsentimental in the way that I am as a small little Labrador puppy bumbling about. So yeah, I've often had these like experiences where find myself quite taken aback by the response that I get. So yeah, that was quite confronting when I thought of it that way.
It makes a lot of sense, though, considering, like, I mean, they have a bigger, they have a much broader kind of concept of time than we do. I mean, we're relating to that building that we have experiences within our little tiny limited amount of time. But like a city that's, 150, 200, 2000 years old, it's just a blip, right?
Mm,
Yeah,
yes.
yeah, that's interesting. That's interesting. Still doesn't help us feel not sad that that building's gone, though, right?
Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
I have to admit I am a fan of optimistic nihilism. Or like, if I'm whenever I get bad news or I'm feeling very overwhelmed or stressed, I go down to the ocean and kind of revel in how insignificant I am. It's like this is meaningless. These troubles will, you know, they'll be forgotten soon enough.
It's humbling, isn't it? It's very humbling,
Mm,
isn't it? Yeah, yeah. But I suppose in some ways that might be what our jobs are, like our function in the universe is to have those relationships on the micro level, so that the macro stuff can be doing its own thing, right?
yes.
Hmm. Let's talk about the sun cult. Talking about the macro level. So started as a joke, and now it's, well, I mean, it's still functioning. You're still doing stuff with it, but tell us a little bit about it. Why was it a joke first, and then it transitioned into something else?
I had some friends of mine kind of make jokes about, like, that I'd make a good cult leader. And at this point I'd already been teaching a little bit of workshops on chaos magic and things like that, and I would make jokes about, like, oh, one day I'm going to have a cult compound, and like own a property and have like lots of little houses on it and things like that. The millennial dream of starting your own village, essentially.
Of course, and all your friends invited, yes.
And yeah, over time I was very influenced by the writings of Cat Valente about the Manticore's Lullaby, a beautiful piece of music accompanying some of her writing. And yeah, I began to like build a relationship with the sun as a manticore and as a kind of paternal figure, a fatherly teacher figure. And like the Manticore Sun is like the primary deity essentially of the Sun cult. And I began to kind of to create content and writings about it, and magical workings and things like that. And it was one of those kind of circumstances where, like, at first I thought that what I was creating was fictional until I realized it wasn't. Like, I don't believe some of the things, some of the entities and deities and egregores and whatnot of the sun cult were actually generated by me. I believe that there were things that I was tapping into. Like, if people ask me who my grandmother is, who my grandparents are, one of my grandmothers is a cat, and one of them is the sea. Like I think of the sea as like a parental figure to me, and like literally, and I mean like metaphorically as well, but also my ancestors were born out of soup, like far back enough, well before mammals existed. Like the
Yes.
sea is also literally like a parent. And so yeah, another some figures that I was kind of found quite confronting when I was using them as kind of metaphors for understanding certain concepts, came to realize rather uncomfortably by coming face to face with them that these were not fictional beings. They're yeah, the ones specifically that I'm referring to are within the Sun Cult. We have a set of 4 entities known the 4 Queens of Death,
Mm.
and I was using them as like because I have quite a lot of underworld liminal space magic in my practice, and I was using them as a way to kind of conceptualize death in a way that is easier for me to like digest and comprehend, because it's such a massive, huge topic and massive subject. And then I had a couple of experiences where I like came face to face with them and realized that they are very old. They probably have many names, but this is what I know them as. And they are very big and, to be frank, very scary to me. And yeah, I was just like, oh, gave me goosebumps realizing like I feel like I kind of accidentally bumbled into something without really realizing what I had done until some that kind of slow dawning clarity eventually came upon me.
That makes a lot of sense, though. It's examples like these where that distinction between real and fictional start to really fall apart, right?
Hmm.
Yeah. So in tapping into these spirits, these beings, what have you noticed? How has your practice changed? Because all of this was before the times, right? Before times. And then we entered into this massive state of death. What happened afterwards for you?
um I think that I have like born a much greater appreciation for uh thinking of myself as a priest or a priestess as a important community role, because rather than like this is something that I do because I want to have community with the trees and animals and things that live around me and deities that I have conversations and relationships with, I've begun to feel more and more important. It's become to feel much more important to me that as a person who is able to build these relationships and be a conduit and have these conversations, that it's really an incredible responsibility and not just something that I do. Like it's just not like a private thing. It's something I actually really want to share with people, and that comes with quite a lot of responsibility. And like thinking yeah, like when I say like a priest as a priest role, I mean like I think it's a really important uh member of the community who is basically like someone who can be like a counselor, somebody who is there to listen to people, someone who is there to provide guidance. And it's like there are so many important roles that people take on in a village, and in our modern hyper individualistic society that has tried to atomize individuals so much so that we can, you don't need to sell you can only sell a community one hammer, but if you break apart the community, you can sell a hammer to every individual. And so yeah, like I feel people are created such an incredible intense hunger to actually return back to more social networks and groups of people. Like I've known women in the community who are like grandmothers to tens of children that they did not birth. That is a role of like this incredible nurturing, like this crone relationship that they can have with all of these grandbabies. Or like I've known people who are death doulas, who are able to like be midwives to the dying, people who are actual midwives. And these like sometimes they are their actual jobs. Sometimes these people work in nursing or healthcare or teachers. But sometimes these are just kind of these roles that these people just naturally slotted into. And the work that they do is so valuable and so important. And so, as everything as it is now, I do feel quite a strong, pressing responsibility to really step up and become involved in my community. And this, rather than this just being a private aspect of my life, is actually something that I really feel called to help people as much as possible, and to be a guide, be a psychopomp essentially, as much as I possibly can.
It makes a lot of sense. That makes a lot of sense. Knowing a little bit about your background, well, knowing a little bit more about your background, I'm curious for you because I feel like a lot of people are hearing that call. They may not necessarily know how, or they may not necessarily know how to do it safely. And I'm wondering for you, how do you keep yourself safe while stepping into that role?
I One of the things that I try to do is have some quite a few close friends who I like to like have check-ins with. I want like just verifications, like, hey, like, run things by them. And people who I feel safe around, that I feel like if I were to make a misstep, I trust them to tell me. I think that's a very important thing for me. For me, like, I don't want to be finding myself in a position where, I've overstepped some boundary or something without realizing it. Like, it's very important to me to have that relationship with people in my life. I also just I'm trying very hard at the moment to break out of a toxic burnout cycle as well. I would overcommit myself and then I would crash and burn. And I'm like,
Right.
yeah, very much focused very, very hard at the moment on creating a sustainable lifestyle for myself that is resilient, so that when I, face adversity, then I am able to keep carrying on this work. Because there have been unfortunate stretches in my life where I've essentially had to put this stuff almost completely on hold while I worked on myself. Because I just, needed to, you know, um, I either my health was very bad or I needed therapy, whatever. It's I needed to, I needed to be able to, put my oxygen mask on before helping my neighbor.
Yes.
And yeah, and another thing is just like realizing when when something is beyond my capabilities, and just kind of being conscientious of community and not having to take on every role, or like not every idea I have is a good idea. Like two examples. I went to a possession minding workshop. So it was basically you babysitting someone who is being possessed. And I found that I'm really bad at it. And I'm like, I, instead of being like, right, this is something I really need to work on, I had to kind of set my ego aside and be like, I am not gifted in this area of my life, and I do not believe that it is worth my time and effort to get better at it, because I have a lot of people in my community who are very gifted and skilled and talented and hardworking in this area. So it's much better that I just defer to them if I needed
Yes.
somebody in whatever circumstances to take on that role. Like, it's,
Yeah.
I can't do everything. It's
Yes.
very important. And
That's huge. That's huge because I feel like in all of the 101 books, it's always presented as you need to be everything. And I feel like a lot of people are discovering, maybe it's because we're all in our 30s now, but we're all discovering that we can't do everything, right? And we shouldn't do everything. Yeah.
yeah. And another thing that I'm very invested in is So it's community safety and accessibility as much as possible. Like I am very interested in shapeshifter magic and masks magic, which is why I'm so invested in LARPing. And like I'd love to do some kind of workshop or something where I like it had people create masks and like mantled, which is like a form of shapeshifting possession work, these animal spirits. And I'm like, if I had a bunch of people in a room and half of them are being possessed by coyotes and half are being possessed by foxes, and I don't know the people very well, it's not going to end well. So it's like that's so many flavors of this could go wrong. So just kind of having a good, long, hard, critical think about like safety for myself and about people's mental health and their boundaries and things like that. Like one of the things when I host public rituals that I try to do is have a template document which is an accessibility outline. So if people like to come to a thing and like fresh and new and don't want to know spoilers, they just don't have to read it. But it'll cover things like physical accessibility. Is like, is there any steps in the venue? Are we using incense? Is there going to be loud drumming? Is there going to be trance work? Is there going to be are we going to be talking about death or loss or grief or anything like that? Are we going to be talking about ancestors or relatives? Are we going to be talking about sex and sexuality? Like just to kind of give a heads up of what people can expect before they come into this space. And I'm very invested in trying to make things as accessible as possible for people. And sometimes it's not possible with competing access needs, but like I just want to work very hard on generating like if I am running a public ritual, for example, in running an event that is as safe as possible, because I know myself if something went really badly, I probably wouldn't know how to handle it. So I just want to make sure it doesn't happen in the first place, but also like delegating. So if I'm going to be running a big event, I always make sure that I have a team of people that I can like, if things go disastrously wrong, I have people I can turn to and be like, help me put out fires because I'm freaking out. So, yeah, delegating is also a big one.
It's huge, right? It's huge. Do you find that it was difficult when you started to understand that for yourself? Because I feel like a lot of people who speak to that, again, because being solitary for so long or not really knowing how to be in a group, it can be difficult to trust somebody to delegate them enough to do something, right? Do you find that for you, or how was it for you?
Yeah, as much as I joke about being a cult leader, I'm also like, a filthy anarchist deep at heart. So I also really don't want to be like, the the supreme authority. But like I also, have like tremendous trust issues. So it's just like, oh, I really need to make sure that the people that I bring into these roles of responsibility are ones that I really trust. And also I need to do some shadow work around my own ego about letting go about perfectionism and things might not go the way that I exactly imagined. And that's fine because, the direction that they took was the direction that they needed to take. Just because that's not how I imagined it happening doesn't mean that's not right. Yeah, so that can be it can be difficult, but I'm working on it.
I love it. I love it. I love it. In truth, I have to be honest. Like I've had a lot of bad experiences with groups, and it took a long time for me to actually feel comfortable in a group. And then that group blew up because there was some untrustworthy people at the top of it, right? It's a real vulnerable place to put yourself into, especially if you're facilitating it.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. This is going to sound
Yeah,
like a weird question. Sorry, go on, please.
I must admit, I've done large group workings, but not like I haven't done a lot of consistent small group work though. 'Cause that's pushing my
Mm.
boundaries of trust issues a little bit. But I'm hoping in future I'll be able to build those kind of relationships.
It's funny. I was just going to ask you that. I went from being completely solitary for years, like similar to you, not knowing any real pagans and like real gay people in real life, right? It was one of those situations, to suddenly be in a circle of 60 people
Mm.
at midnight on a Saturday night, middle of nowhere, Ontario, right? And so that was like me deep diving, right? but with small groups, I feel the same. I haven't met people close to me. I met people far away from me who I feel like I would have that ability to build. But it's yeah, it takes a lot of vulnerability. For you then, how does that group facilitating, that large group facilitating, how has that impacted your personal practice, your individual practice, if at all?
Yeah, so when I first started really kind of developing a like a more solid framework for what the Sun Cult is about and our practices and mythos and just general ritual structure and things like that, it was like just something that I did, and then like the group work that I was doing with other people was like a different part of my life. Like my paganism was still pretty compartmentalized, but as time has passed, uh although I'm because the Sun Cult is quite influenced by reclaiming, there's still quite a bit overlap there. So I don't really compartmentalize the two of them that much because they were a very strong influence and a strong ancestor to the Sun Cult. But as time passes, these kind of things that I would do in a group setting, or like the kind of things that I think of as Sun Cult practices, have just kind of like just become my pagan practice in general. Although, like when I am facilitating a large group ritual, for example, the experience is very different to what I would do on my own. And like I do often find myself, if I have the energy, I will do a small private version of the same ritual, because facilitating the ritual is not the same thing as doing it. Sometimes that's enough for me, but sometimes I'm just like, oh yeah, like I want to actually go through this process on my own and do like a little mini version of it, because the especially with like trance work or something, like it's very different, or just any kind of facilitation work, because I'm very conscientious about the timing, about the weather, because we won't do most of our things outdoors, about like making sure that there aren't any problems and that everybody's feeling safe, and that like we're not being interfered with by the public, and like like I'm very like switched on in that like responsibility role, and so instead of like being able to go deep and actually unpack the things that we're covering, yeah, I kind of end up doing like a little mirrored version at home a lot of the time. Yeah, like it has certainly changed how I approach things quite a lot, but I do love doing group work, and I think one of the things that I love about it is that sense of like accountability. Like I'm terrible and would often be just like, you know, like on the solstices or equinoxes, just like go outside and like pour some beer on the ground. There you go. That's good enough. She'll be all right, mate. Like if I'm doing a big thing, I'm like, right, actually I have to properly write this ritual and I'm gonna devote myself to it. And I think a lot of other people probably feel the same way, that like, yeah, I'm gonna go to a group thing and it means I'm actually gonna do it. And like instead of just being like, oh, like I'll slack off this time around. So like, yeah, I find it really like the accountability aspect of it, I think, is really valuable to me.
It raises a good question, right, about kind of the continuum of lived experience, like, I mean, you can just be pouring a beer and saying, have a great day, mate, and still be completely present, right? Versus, like, and I've been in group rituals where it was very abundantly clear that the organizer was not present, right? But that's my trauma. We're not going to go into that. Oh, Dorian, this has been wonderful. I could ask you millions of questions more, but it is also getting on for you, and I've kept you long enough. But this was wonderful. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you so much for having me on. It's a pleasure and a privilege.
So the privilege is all mine. So if people are interested in finding out more about you, do you still have your Etsy page?
I believe so. We have a
Yes.
Discord as well.
Okay.
Our website, which will hopefully be up and running by the time this airs, is queerpagan.com,
Okay.
that you can go to find out more about the Sovereigns of the Golden Path. If
Perfect.
you want to find out more about me personally, my personal webpage is whitemanticore.com, and you can find all of my other various social links from there.
Perfect. I will make sure that all those links are down below, especially if you're in Australia, or if you're planning on visiting Australia. Do check out Dorian's stuff. And in the meantime, Dorian, thank you so much for coming on again. And we're now coming really right down to the end of the season. I think we've only got a couple of episodes left before we start season 4. So for those, this will be coming out around the holiday time. So for those who are celebrating a holiday of many kinds, happy holidays. And for those who are not, have a wonderful rest of your week. Dorian, you have a good rest of your night, and I'm going to have a good rest of my day.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.